The observation deck of Crystalline Station stretched before Matteo Valens like a cathedral of stars. Nebulae swirled in brilliant purples and oranges beyond the transparent aluminum walls, each gas cloud holding secrets he'd spent 8 years training to unlock. He pressed his palm against the cool surface, letting the cosmic vista pull him deeper into the silence he'd been chasing since leaving Earth. 3 months. That's how long he'd been running. Long enough for the sting of Sophia's betrayal to dull into a manageable ache, though the memory of finding her with his former colleague still burned like phantom fire. The xenobotanical research position on Crystalline Station had felt like salvation, a remote outpost at the edge of charted space, where the most unusual flora in the known galaxy flourished in the planet's unique mineral-rich soil. A place where he could lose himself in work and forget what it felt like to have his heart shattered. Are you always this melancholic when observing the cosmos? Matteo spun around, startled from his contemplation. The woman behind him was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her skin shimmered with an ethereal silver luminescence, almost as though she was wrought from moonlight itself. She stood at perhaps 6 feet tall, with an elegantly elongated frame and eyes that seemed to contain their own constellation of stars. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of pale platinum, and she wore robes of a diaphanous material that seemed to flow with liquid grace. Sorry. I didn't hear you approach, Matteo stammered, suddenly hyper-aware of his rather ordinary human appearance. Dark brown hair, unremarkable features, and the kind of gangly frame that came from dedicating oneself to books rather than the gym. I was just admiring the view. The woman tilted her head with curious elegance. Admiring, yes, but also grieving. I can see it in the way you hold yourself, the weight in your eyes. I'm Syra, by the way. I'm told you've rented Unit 847 in the residential sector. I'm the property manager, though I prefer to think of myself as more of a custodian. She extended a hand. Matteo shook it, struck by how cool her skin felt, almost refreshing against his own warmth. Matteo Valens. I'm here with the Institute's Botanical Research Division. I'll be studying the native flora for the next year, possibly longer. Ah, yes. The strange human who requested the unit with the largest access to natural light, Syra said, and he could have sworn he detected amusement in her melodic voice. I was beginning to wonder if you were more plant than animal. Sometimes I think that would be simpler, Matteo replied before he could stop himself. The admission hung between them, far too honest for a first meeting. Syra's expression shifted into something resembling sympathy. Loss? There was something in the directness of her question that compelled honesty. Is it that obvious? I've lived on this station for 12 years, she said, moving to stand beside him at the observation window. I've learned to read the grammar of human sadness. Your particular dialect suggests romantic betrayal. She paused. I apologize if that's presumptuous. My species tends toward directness. We're not particularly good at the small talk dances that humans practice. Despite everything, Matteo found himself smiling. You've got good instincts. Yeah. Someone I trusted made a choice I couldn't accept. So I chose distance, running away. Attempting to run towards something better, Matteo corrected gently. Syra nodded as though approving this reframing. A subtle but important distinction. Come, let me show you your unit, and perhaps I can offer you the station's most therapeutic remedy for romantic heartbreak, which is growing things, she said simply. Nothing heals quite like watching life flourish under your care. An hour later, Matteo stood in the center of Unit 847 and felt something inside him loosen for the first time in months. The apartment was smaller than he'd expected, but the walls were almost entirely transparent, offering panoramic views of both the station's interior gardens and the cosmos beyond. The furniture was sleek and minimal silver and chrome, befitting Aurelian design aesthetics. But what took his breath away was the secondary chamber that Syra revealed with obvious pride. This was constructed specifically because I recalled in your intake form that you'd need laboratory space for your research, Syra explained, gesturing to the space lined with hydroponic systems, specimen tanks, and analytical equipment, all state-of-the-art, recently updated. The previous tenant was a mycologist, so the environmental controls are already calibrated for complex biological work. Syra, this is incredible. I wasn't expecting anything like. Matteo moved to the equipment, running his fingers along the smooth surfaces. How much extra is this going to cost me? Nothing, she said. It's part of the base rent. The station council subsidizes research housing. You're contributing to our collective knowledge. It would be short-sighted to charge you for the privilege. When Matteo turned back to her, he found Syra studying the specimens he'd removed from his duffel bag carefully preserved samples of Earth flora. She held a small glass vial containing seeds up to the light, her eyes widening. "These are from Earth?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine wonder. "Yeah, I always carry some with me. Helps me remember home when I'm feeling lost," Matteo admitted. "That one's from a cherry blossom tree. Symbolizes renewal in my culture. Seemed appropriate for a fresh start." Syra turned the vial over in her delicate hands with reverent care. "We have nothing quite like this. Our plants are more crystalline in nature, geometrical, beautiful in their own way, but your Earth specimens are so organic, so chaotic, so full of possibility." She glanced at him with those starlit eyes. "Would you perhaps be willing to share some knowledge? To explain why you find these humble seeds so meaningful?" Matteo felt something shift in his chest, not the painful wrenching of heartbreak, but something gentler. The beginning of interest, perhaps. The first spark of genuine curiosity about another person in what felt like forever. "I'd like that," he said. "Actually, would you maybe want to grab dinner? There's supposed to be a decent restaurant in the station's commercial sector. I could explain Earth botany. You could explain the local flora. And we could both pretend to understand what the food is that they're serving us." Syra's face transformed with a smile that was so genuinely delighted it made Matteo's breath catch. "I would very much like that, Matteo Valens. Let me just notify my assistant that I'll be unavailable this evening." As she stepped into the other room to make her call, Matteo looked back at the vial of cherry blossom seeds still clutched in his hand and felt, for the first time since arriving at Crystalline Station, like he might actually be moving forward rather than simply running away. 4 weeks had passed since that first dinner, and Matteo had discovered something remarkable. Time moved differently when you were genuinely interested in someone. Days seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Research that should have consumed all his attention became secondary to the moments he stole with Syra. They fell into a rhythm, an unspoken agreement that evenings belonged to exploration of both the botanical greenhouse they'd begun cultivating together and the landscape of each other's cultures. Tonight, they stood in what had become their sanctuary, a converted corner of the station's main agricultural sector that Syra had designated as their personal garden project. The space hummed with life. Hydroponic towers held earth plants tomatoes that bloomed with astonishing vigor under the station's optimized lighting, delicate herbs that perfumed the air with basil and mint. Beside them, crystalline Aurelian flora grew in intricate geometric patterns, their structures refracting light into rainbow prisms that danced across the walls. "The hybrid soil composition is working better than I anticipated," Matteo observed, adjusting the nutrient levels in one of the irrigation systems. He could feel Syra's presence beside him, that cool, electric tingle that had begun to feel like home. "The earth nitrogen-fixing bacteria are actually cooperating with your Aurelian mineral-binding organisms. It shouldn't work in theory, but Life finds ways to cooperate when given the chance. Syra finished, her hand brushing his as she gestured toward a vine he'd introduced from earth jasmine. It had wound itself through one of her crystal lattice structures, creating something neither fully one thing nor another, but beautiful in its HYBRIDITY. Mateo turned to face her fully. Syra wore one of the more form-fitting ensembles he'd seen from her, a fitted top of silvery material that seemed to absorb and reflect the ambient light, paired with flowing trousers. Her hair was braided tonight, elaborate patterns woven throughout, and he'd learned enough about Aurelian culture to know that this was significant. It meant intention, care. It meant she'd thought about this evening before arriving. "You did something different with your hair," he said, reaching out tentatively. "It's beautiful." Syra's luminescent skin seemed to glow slightly brighter, the Aurelian equivalent of blushing, he'd discovered. "Vas, that's my sister," she insisted. "I make more effort with my appearance." She said, and I quote, "If you're going to spend every evening with that charming human, you should at least try not to look like you've been working in the gardens all day." Syra shook her head with affectionate exasperation. "My sister lacks subtlety." Mateo laughed. "For what it's worth, you look beautiful, even fresh from the gardens. But I like this too. Both versions of you." The space between them seemed to shrink. Syra's eyes, those impossible starlit eyes, held his with an intensity that made his heartbeat accelerate. "Mateo, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Mateo's stomach twisted. This was at the moment where reality intruded, where she'd ask about Sophia, about whether he was truly ready for this, about whether a human and an Aurelian could actually build something sustainable, or if this was just a romantic interlude before they moved on to their respective lives. "Anything," he said, meaning it. "When we first met, I sensed pain in you, betrayal. You've explained the circumstances, your colleague, the broken trust. But I need to know if you're using me to run from that pain, or if you're—" She paused, searching for words. "If you're genuinely present with me, or if I'm simply a pleasant distraction." It was such a perfectly Aurelian question, cutting through pretense directly to the emotional core. Mateo appreciated it immensely, even as it terrified him, because the honest answer was complicated. "I came here running," he admitted. "I was broken, and I thought distance and work would fix me. But then I met you, and something changed. It wasn't instantaneous. I'm not going to pretend it was love at first sight or some fairy tale. But over these 4 weeks, getting to know you, spending time with you, watching you become genuinely excited about my Earth research, listening to you tell stories about growing up in the Aurelian colonies." He reached out, cupping her cheek gently, feeling the delicate pattern of bioluminescent scales that marked her temples. "I stopped running away from Sophia and started running toward you." "There's a difference. How can you be certain?" Syra asked, but her hand came up to hold his wrist, keeping his hand against her face. "I'm not," Mateo said. "Not completely. But I know that when I'm not with you, I think about you constantly. I know that I want to understand your culture deeply, not just superficially. I know that I'd rather spend an evening in this greenhouse with you than anywhere else in the galaxy. That has to count for something." Syra closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they seemed to contain more stars than before. "I've been trying so hard not to feel what I'm feeling," she confessed softly. "In Aurelian culture, we pair bond seriously. It's not casual for us. When we choose someone, we're theoretically choosing them for life. For decades, sometimes centuries, depending on our lifespan in each cycle. I was terrified that what I felt for you was just fascination, the appeal of the exotic, the foreign. But it's not. I genuinely care for you, Mateo, in a way that feels permanent." Mateo's breath caught. 4 weeks, and this woman was ready to contemplate forever. It should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself overwhelmingly certain. "I care for you too," he said, and then he leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Syra met him halfway, and their kiss was nothing like the tentative, exploratory contact he'd experienced with previous lovers. This was deep, certain. It tasted like jasmine and possibility, and when they finally broke apart, Matteo felt fundamentally changed. "So we're doing this," Syra said, her forehead resting against his. "We're actually attempting an interspecies relationship." "Apparently we are," Matteo replied, smiling. "I have to warn you, humans can be complicated. So can Aurelians. We're prone to overthinking and isolation. But perhaps our flaws balance each other." She pulled back just enough to look at him properly. "I should tell you that Kalen is arriving tomorrow." "Your research partner from the Botanical Institute?" Matteo nodded. He'd been expecting the visit for 2 weeks. Kalen was supposed to help him with some of the more complex analysis work on the native crystalline flora. "Yeah, he'll probably want to see the lab and the progress we've made. He might also attempt to sabotage our relationship," Syra said with uncharacteristic hesitation. "I've been reviewing social protocols, and apparently human males often engage in what you call protective behavior regarding their colleagues' romantic choices, particularly when the choice is deemed unusual or potentially risky." Matteo laughed, though there was some truth to her concern. "Kellen's a good guy, but he can be overprotective. Don't worry. I'll manage him." They spent the next 3 hours in their garden, moving between research discussions and increasingly intimate conversations. Syra shared stories about her childhood among the crystal formations of her homeworld, about learning to manipulate the natural mineral structures into art and architecture. Matteo told her about his mother's obsession with tropical plants, about the greenhouse she'd maintained despite living in an urban environment, about how that had sparked his entire career path. The next morning, Kalen arrived like a storm. He was a compact man with sharp features and perpetually suspicious, eyes brilliant as a scientist, but occasionally insufferable as a human being. He took one look at the greenhouse, assessed the hybrid plants, and then noticed the pair of coffee cups on the workbench, positioned close together. "Don't tell me," he said, turning to Matteo with an expression of theatrical dismay. "You've gone native already. It's been 4 weeks. 4 weeks, Matteo, and you're already tangled up with a local. Do you have any idea how that complicates the research? Not to mention the ethical considerations of—" "Kalen," Matteo interrupted calmly. "This is Syra. She's the property manager, yes, but she's also brilliant. And she's been instrumental in helping me understand the native flora in ways I couldn't have alone. And before you ask, no, the relationship hasn't affected my work. If anything, it's enhanced it." Syra stepped forward with what Matteo recognized as her diplomatic expression, the one she used when dealing with difficult station council members. "I'm aware of human social protocols around workplace relationships and romantic involvement. I also understand that you're concerned about your colleagues' well-being and the integrity of the research. Both of these are valid. However, I would argue that my involvement has been purely beneficial to the botanical work, and I'm committed to maintaining professional boundaries in all research contexts." Kalen studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, his expression softened. "You've clearly done your homework on human social interaction patterns." "I have been learning," Syra confirmed. "Your species is fascinating. Contradictory, but fascinating." "Well, I can't fault that assessment," Kalen said dryly. He looked back at Matteo. "I'm not going to pretend I understand this. Cross-species romance isn't exactly something the Institute prepares you for. But if you're happy, and if it's not affecting the work, then I suppose I'm not in a position to object." He paused, adding with a slight smile, "Though I reserve the right to be overprotective and occasionally insufferable. It's in my job description as fellow researcher and friend." "That seems fair," Matteo agreed, relief flooding through him. Over the next 2 weeks, Kalen integrated into their research group, and surprisingly, he and Syra developed an effective working relationship. The three of them spent late nights analyzing data, debating botanical theories, and gradually, Kalen stopped looking at them with suspicion and started looking at them with something approaching understanding. But then, on the 15th day of Kellen's visit, everything shifted. Matteo's communication device chimed. A message from Sophia. He stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Her face appeared on his screen, beautiful, familiar, gut-wrenching in her familiarity. The message was simple. "I've been miserable without you. I made a mistake. Please call me. We can work through this." His hand trembled. "Is everything all right?" Syra asked from across the lab. Looking up from her analysis of crystalline formation patterns, Matteo didn't answer immediately. He was fighting an internal war. Sophia. After months of trying to forget her, there she was, offering reconciliation, offering the possibility of going back to what had felt safe and known before everything fell apart. Matteo? Syra's voice held an edge, now uncertainty, maybe fear. He looked up at her, at this extraordinary alien woman who had somehow become essential to him, and realized he was facing the kind of choice that defined who you were, who you wanted to be. "It's nothing," he heard himself say. "Just something I need to delete." But even as he sent the message to trash, he saw the moment Syra's expression changed. She'd sensed the lie, the hesitation, and suddenly, the fragile thing they'd been building felt very fragile indeed. 3 days after Sophia's message, the alarm started. The station's emergency system screamed to life at 0347 hours, jolting Matteo from restless sleep. He'd been sleeping alone since the Sophia incident, a decision made without words, but understood perfectly by Syra. Not quite a breakup, but not quite a relationship either. Suspended, waiting, he stumbled out of bed and pulled up the station's emergency broadcast on his communication device. The words made his blood run cold. Critical alert. Nebula storm of unprecedented magnitude approaching station trajectory. All residents advised to proceed to evacuation shelters immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Matteo grabbed clothes, threw essentials into a bag with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd trained for emergency protocols, and bolted from his unit. The corridors were chaos, residents moving in every direction, security personnel shouting directions, the station's systems flashing red danger warnings along the walls. He made it to the evacuation shelter and was in the process of checking the roster when he realized Syra hadn't registered. His heart stopped. He ran through the list 3 times, then looked at the security officer managing the shelter. Syra Vale, property manager. Is she on any other evacuation list? The officer, a tired-looking zenith with 4 arms, already processing hundreds of evacuees, checked her screens. No registration on any primary shelter. Has she checked in at the commercial sector evacuation point? Matteo didn't wait for further information. He reversed course, moving against the stream of evacuating residents, pushing back into the corridors of the station. Warning klaxons screamed overhead, but Matteo barely registered them. His entire focus was narrow and singular, finding Syra. He made it to the commercial sector to find it largely empty. Most businesses had already closed, their employees moved to safety. But the botanical gardens, their gardens showed signs of recent habitation. Equipment was still running, specimen chambers still humming with power. He found her in the central greenhouse, calmly watering one of the hybrid jasmine vines that had become their project. Syra! He ran toward her. "We have to go. Now. The evacuation, I'm aware of the evacuation, she said with infuriating calm, her silvery hands continuing to mist the delicate flowers. I've been monitoring the storm's progression. We have approximately 90 minutes before the plasma wave reaches the station. Plenty of time to reach the shelters. Then why are you here? Matteo demanded, grabbing her hand and trying to pull her away. She didn't budge. Because these plants, our plants, are irreplaceable, Syra said, finally turning to face him. Her luminescent skin was dimmer than usual, clearly stressed. They represent 12 weeks of collaborative work. 12 weeks of proving that your Earth flora and my Aurelian species can coexist, can create something new and beautiful together. I couldn't leave them to die. Syra, they're plants. Matteo's voice cracked with desperation and fear. They can be replaced. You can't. They matter to me, she said simply. And yes, I can be replaced. In another century, there will be other Aurelians. Other xenobiologists, other property managers. But what we've created here, it's unique, irreplaceable. Matteo looked around at the garden they'd nurtured together. She was right. This representation of collaboration, of two species finding common ground through growth and care, it was rare. Maybe unique, but it was also symbolic. Replaceable in a way that Syra wasn't. He made a decision. Matteo pulled Syra toward him with sudden force, grabbed her hand with both of his, and started physically dragging her toward the exit. She protested, but his desperation overrode her resistance. The plants will survive, or they won't. But you're coming with me. Right now. No arguments. They made it as far as the main corridor when the first shock wave hit. The station lurched violently, sending them both sprawling to the floor. Alarms that had been urgent became apocalyptic. Through the transparent aluminum walls, the sky had transformed into something nightmare-swirling plasma radiation storms. The very fabric of space torn apart into a maelstrom of colors that shouldn't exist together. The secondary shelter is this way, Syra gasped, pulling herself up. The primary evacuation point won't. She didn't need to finish. A massive explosion erupted from somewhere deep in the station's infrastructure. The lights flickered, died, then came back up running on emergency power, bathing everything in sickly red illumination. They ran half-crawling as the station shuddered around them. Every structural groan suggesting imminent collapse. They found the secondary shelter entrance sealed. No, Matteo breathed, pulling at the emergency release mechanism. It wasn't responding. This way, Syra said, grabbing his hand and pulling him into a maintenance corridor he hadn't noticed. It's narrower, less stable, but it connects to the engineering sector. There's a secure bunker there. Smaller, but capable of withstanding significantly more structural stress. They ran through passages that seemed to snake endlessly through the station's depths, each new shock wave sending debris cascading around them. Matteo's lungs burned, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs. But he didn't release Syra's hand. Not for a second. The engineering bunker was small, barely 10 feet square, lined with reinforced alloys and isolated from the station's main systems. Syra sealed the door behind them, just as another catastrophic explosion shook the entire structure. The bunker groaned but held. They stood in the dim emergency lighting, chest heaving, trying to process what had just happened. Outside the bunker's small reinforced window, the station's interior was visible in sections between interference static, fire, ruptures, devastation. We could have died, Matteo said stupidly, still gripping Syra's hand. Yes, Syra agreed. Her luminescence was erratic now, pulsing with distress. But we didn't. More explosions. They huddled closer. Matteo found himself pulling Syra into his arms, and she came willingly, her cool, smooth form pressing against him. They sat like that for hours as the nebula storm raged outside, waiting to find out if the bunker would hold, or if this was simply the setup to a slower death. Around hour 5, the shaking finally began to diminish. The plasma storm was passing. Gradually, communications returned. Station security reported catastrophic damage, but confirmed that all residents who'd reached primary and secondary shelters had survived. The damages to the station's infrastructure were severe, but repairable. "Syra," Matteo said into the darkness of the bunker, "I need to tell you something." She was still pressed against him, her head resting on his chest. "Yes?" When Sophia messaged me, I hesitated. I read her words, and for a moment, just a moment, I considered responding positively. Considered going back to what was known and safe. Syra tensed. "I suspected." "But then I thought about you," Matteo continued. "About how you chose to water plants when you should have been evacuating because you cared about what we'd created together. I realized that real love isn't about going back to what's comfortable. It's about moving forward with someone, even when it's scary and uncertain and completely illogical." He pulled back just enough to see her face. "I'm sorry I hesitated. I'm sorry for the distance these past 3 days. And I'm asking for a chance to make it right, if you'll have me." Syra's luminescence brightened gradually, spreading from her skin in soft waves. "I love you," she said, the words carrying an Aurelian weight that suggested she understood the significance of what she was stating. "Not because you're exotic or foreign, or because you understand my plans, but because you see me, really see me. And I love who I am when I'm with you." Matteo closed the distance between them and kissed her deeply. It wasn't tentative or exploratory. It was certain. It was home. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "I think I have for weeks. I was just too scared to admit it." They held each other as the nebula storm finally passed, as rescue teams began coordinating station repairs, as the immediate crisis resolved into recovery and reconstruction. And in that small bunker, in the heart of a damaged space station, they made a promise to each other, not in words, but in the certainty of their connection, the confirmation that some things were worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth building toward together. The station would recover. The gardens would be replanted. But more importantly, what Matteo and Syra had discovered in the depths of emergency and fear was that their bond was stronger than circumstance, more durable than comfort, more real than any safe, familiar choice could ever be.